Hi, my name is Simon Morris, and I will be presenting on Faking the Fear, Testing the Cultural Risk Theory in the American Public. My problem statement is that gun violence has been a rising problem in the United States over the last 20 to 30 years. On average, 38,000 Americans die every year from gun violence, and 100 die on average every day. And since the Columbine High School shooting in 1999, there have been 11 mass school shootings. And also, the United States tops the most school shootings in the world. And some of the motivations for school shootings included depression, seeking revenge, and bullying. One of the most recent mass shootings happened on April the 15th in Indianapolis, Indiana. A 19-year-old male named Brandon Hole shot and killed 8 people at a FedEx facility in Indiana, then killed himself. And this is just one of the many instances of gun violence in America. And from looking at this, the risk of more mass shootings happening is very real. And the deficiency statement that I have is students on studies on the perception of Americans to the issue of gun violence is largely understudied. The sociopolitics of the pro-gun stance of the people dominates mostly in the southern states, while those who are against guns are often associated with the northern states. And the purpose statement that I have is the purpose of this paper is to explore the nuisance of gun violence in the United States. In particular, this research will test the theory of cultural risk perception by comparing political parties in America, age, sex, and race. This research is significant in understanding the varying degrees of likelihood to support or oppose guns, especially in times of threat and risk. The results of this study allow us to explore the cultural narratives that promotes or opposes guns. And the hypothesis that I have is this paper hypothesizes that cultural risk perceptions of gun violence are significantly different by political party affiliation, race, sex, region, and education. And cultural risk perceptions will be measured based on their willingness for the participant to allow the purchase of guns if the individual is noted in a no-fly zone, having mental illness, the purchase of high-capacity guns, the willingness to have a gun registry, preference to carry guns in any places at school, background checks, and shortening the period of buying guns. So the theory that I have is the cultural risk theory of risk associated with Mary Douglas and Aaron Wildavsky systemizes that the relationship between risk evaluation, social norms, and political conflict. The cultural theory of risk proposes that risk perception and concern about environmental or social issues are socially and culturally framed. So this means that the values and worldviews of certain social or cultural contexts shape the individual's perception and evaluation of risk. So today, the United States has 120.5 guns per 100 people, or about 393,347,000 guns, which is the highest total and per capita number in the world. 22% of Americans own one or more guns, 35% of which are men, and 12% which are women. In the Second Amendment, the statement, a well regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. America's early governmental preoccupation with gun possession, storage, and regulation was tied to the overarching concern for public safety, even as it intruded into citizens' private gun ownership and habits. So, some of the first gun control measures that were taken in the colonial times were criminalizing the transfer of guns to Catholics, slaves, indentured servants, and Native Americans, regulating the storage of gunpowder in homes, banning loaded guns in Boston houses, and mandating participation in formal gatherings of troops and door to door surveys about guns owned. Later on in the 1800s, we see many policies come into play that had to do with slaves, and most of them started in the South. And after President Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863, and after the 13th Amendment to the Constitution abolishing slavery was adopted, and the Civil War ended in 1865, states persisted in prohibiting blacks who were free from owning guns under laws that were slave codes, which were renamed the Black Codes. And in 1938, the Federal Firearms Act made it illegal to sell guns to convicted felons and required a gun license, which is still in practice today. In 1968, the Gun Control Act was signed into law by President Lyndon B. Johnson, and it regulated interstate gun commerce, prohibiting interstate transfer unless completed among licensed manufacturers, importers, and dealers, and restricts gun ownership. The next gun laws were in 1994, 2005, and 2016, were all signed by Clinton, Bush, and Obama, and they were about banning rifles, suing gun companies, and extensive background checks. The availability of guns and other firearms is closely connected to the large number of shootings that result in injury and death in the United States schools. Gun-related violence has been attributed as the major cause of violent death in the United States of American schools since 1992. And every day, more than 100 Americans are killed with guns, and 200 more are shot and wounded. The effects of gun violence extend far beyond these casualties. Gun violence shapes the lives of millions of Americans who witness it, know someone who was shot, or live in fear of the next shooting. The average deaths in the United States are 37,603, with 61 are from suicide, 36% from homicide, and only 1% are from police shootings. The U.S. gun suicide rate is 10 times higher than other higher income countries, with white men representing 74% of firearm suicide victims in the United States. In America, 1/3 of gun deaths are homicides, with the rate being 25 times higher than other high income countries like the U.S. The African American community gets hit the hardest with homicide victims, with the rate being 10 times more likely to die by homicide than white people. And with children and teens, firearms are the leading cause of death, with African American children and teens being 14 times more likely than white children and teens to die by gun homicide. In 2019, 60% of Americans said that gun laws in the United States should be stricter. The surprising thing is that when both the Democratic and Republican population in the United States was asked if the gun law should be stricter, it was 86% Democrat and 31% Republican that were for it. 8 in 10 Republicans say it's more important to protect the right of Americans to own guns than it is to control gun ownership, while just 21% of Democrats say the same. That 59 percentage point partisan gap is up from a 29-point gap in 2008. So the following statement comes from the Democratic Party website, and it says, Democrats believe that we can reduce gun violence while respecting the rights of responsible gun owners. We believe we should expand and strengthen background checks for those who want to purchase a firearm, because it shouldn't be easier to get a gun than a driver's license. We believe we should ensure that guns don't fall into the hands of terrorists, whether they be domestic or foreign, domestic abusers, other violent criminals, or those who have shown signs of danger towards themselves or others. And we believe we should treat gun violence as the deadly public health crisis it is. And the Republican Views website argues that the GOP, the Grand Old Party, is keen to point out that the Republican position on gun rights does not flow from a fondness for weapons, but from a fundamental principle that calls for upholding certain rights that the nation was built upon. Republicans believe that governmental regulation of firearms is largely unconstitutional, and therefore most gun laws are an infringement on the individual's rights to bear arms. So this is the data that I have come up with, and it says the American Trends Panel, the ATP, is a national probability-based online panel of adults in the United States living in households. The 25th wave of the panel survey was fielded for the Pew Research Center by ABT SRBI from March 13th to March 27th, 2017. In total, 4,151 ATP members completed the Wave 25 survey. The survey was administered in English and in Spanish. The survey weights are provided to account for different probabilities of selection into the panel, as well as differential and non-responsive to the panel recruitment survey, the panel invitation, and the panel survey itself. The margin of sampling error for full sample weighted estimates is plus or minus 2.67 percentage points. And the target population for Wave 25 was non-institutionalized persons age 18 and over living in the U.S., including Alaska and Hawaii. The sample consisted of 5,177 members of the ATP, which is a probability-based online panel of adults in the United States. And the ATP originally consisted of 8,314 members. However, 741 members requested to be removed from the panel prior to the start of Wave 25. And an additional 2,396 panelists were removed prior to the start of Wave 25 because they had not responded to any of the panel surveys since their recruitment or were unable to be reached by email, phone, or mail. So the instrument, the questionnaire was developed by the Pew Research Center in consultation with ABT SRBI. In order to improve the quality of the data, the web program was rigorously tested by the ABT SRBI project management team and PRC researchers. So test scenarios were created for all possible combinations of sample variables and question filters to ensure all skip logic was functioning correctly. And the test data was then analyzed to determine that all logic was correct. And after the initial testing and corrections, the questionnaire was tested through our autopilot program, which is a simulation of the data collected for the survey. So the variables that I had, so the independent variable was the perception of risk with gun violence, and the dependent variables were political view, gender, religion, education, and race. So this research utilizes ANOVA to test, compare, and compare different dependent variables on the perception of risk with gun violence by political views, sex, religion, education, and race. So the ANOVA is a collection of statistical models and their associated estimation procedures, such as the variation among and between groups, used to analyze the differences among group means in a sample. So this is the first table that I have in my presentation, and for barring gun purchases for no-fly zone / watch list individuals, there's a strong correlation with political ideology. For mental illness, the only variable that really had a strong correlation is education. For the assault-style weapons, the strong correlations were education, race, political ideology, and religion. For a federal database to track gun sales, the variables that had strong correlations were sex and religion. And for banning high-capacity ammunition magazines, the variables that had strong correlations were sex, religion, and education. For the Table 3 results, for allowing to carry concealed guns in more places, there's a strong correlation with education. For allowing to carry concealed guns without a permit, there's a strong correlation with religion. For allowing teachers and school officials to carry guns in K through 12 schools, there's no correlation with any variables. And for shortening waiting periods to buy guns legally, there's a strong correlation with religion and education. And for background checks for private gun sales, there's no correlation with any variables. So the discussion and some of the things that I came up with were that the results show that the dependent variables that had the strongest correlations were political ideology, religion, and education. So according to political ideology, we can gather that the more liberal people in this study were all for stricter laws in our country. And over the last few weeks, the Biden administration has written laws that would provide stricter gun laws in our nation. But in Tennessee, our governor has gone against these laws and is making the concealed carrying of guns legal for everyone that wants to. Also, religion plays a big part, especially among Christians, for opposing any measures to prevent laws against guns or banning guns. And this seems to be a sacred association that it is a God-given right for many Americans to own guns. And these are my references. Thank you so much for listening to my presentation. I hope you enjoyed it and have a great day.